New polling out of Israel finds a majority of Israelis support a future demilitarized Palestinian state if it's tied to the release of all the October 7 hostages. The Times of Israel reports that 51% of respondents said they supported a deal that would see the release of all remaining hostages, Saudi Arabia to agree to normalizing relations with Israel, and Jerusalem agreeing to the eventual establishment of a demilitarized Palestinian state. This week, bereaved family members of the missing hostages stormed the Israeli parliament to demand their loved ones be freed. About 20 people in total disrupted the Monday Knesset meeting with chants of "Free them now" and "You will not sit here while they die there."
The Times of Israel also reports that the Netanyahu government has proposed a hostage release deal that would suspend the war in Gaza for 2 months and significantly reduce the number of IDF fighters deployed to the Strip afterwards. This week, a no-confidence motion put forward against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu failed, with only 18 votes in support. Joining us now to weigh in on all of this news out of Israel is Ami Kozak, political commentator, musician, and comedian. Thank you so much for joining Rising.
Thank you guys for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Let's dive right into it. This deal sounds good to me in theory, good to, every side getting something they want, an end to violence, return of hostages, some pathway forward. But I guess the question is it realistic given what's going on in the political constraints?
Well, I don't really understand what the political constraints are, given the fact that I don't understand why this hasn't been something everyone has agreed upon from the very beginning, the unconditional return of men, women, and children being taken hostage and kidnapped from their homes in Gaza. That would certainly have led to de-escalation after October 7th, and I don't understand why there hasn't also been a call for the unconditional surrender of Hamas. And as far as constraints go, I think that a lot of people engaged in this conversation are confused, thinking that this is about geography, when I think this is really about an ideological hatred of Israel, the Jewish state, and Jews worldwide by the regime that it's fighting, which is Hamas. They don't want just geography. They want to destroy all the Jews. This is their ideology. This is what they say proudly. So any apologist for them, any excuse for them, and any illusion that this is a political dispute or a geographical dispute, I think is very misguided.
In 1948, 700,000 Palestinians were driven from what is now described as Israel into Gaza, and their descendants are largely the refugees of that initial displacement. What to you, if this is not a geographical or a self-determination dispute, as some might phrase it, should happen to the now 2.3 million people who live in Gaza?
Well, I take issue a little bit with the fundamental phrasing of the question that they were just displaced out of nowhere, as if some usurping population came and kicked them out. There was a UN partition plan to create 2 states for 2 peoples, as there were legitimate populations of people, Jews and Arabs, living in the land. And Israel has accepted it many, many times, offerings for peace and a 2-state solution. But certainly what we're dealing with now is Hamas representing these populations, and you lose a lot of moral credibility and political credibility when you seek to destroy the Jewish state. I don't think the efforts here have been about creating a prosperous Palestinian state. They've had many opportunities to do that. Rather, it's about dismantling the only Jewish state that exists.
Well, what do you make then of Netanyahu's long-term bolstering of Hamas, articulating a desire to displace any more moderate politics to come out of Palestine in favor of one that can enable him to make the argument that Palestinians don't really want peace? Obviously, there was the famous reporting of suitcases of cash being delivered from Israel to Hamas. This isn't really a dispute, right? So where do you put that as you're trying to come to terms with, whether or not Israel is playing a role in the particular politics that have been chosen, not anytime recently, obviously the last election was 17 plus years ago, but that has been chosen as a legitimate kind of elected government of Gaza?
Well, I don't even know if I grant you that, but for argument's sake, if I grant you that somehow in some twisted way, Netanyahu, who is now politically doomed in Israeli society for being responsible for a massive security failure, somehow wants this to happen or wants Hamas to succeed, why do you make every effort to shield Hamas of any agency or responsibility for their actions. They're independent actors that have committed atrocities against Israel, that seek to destroy Israel. They're very explicit about that. They're very proud about their anti-Semitism and their Jew hatred. So why is that not the first question? Whether or not how Israeli politicians have responded to dealing with them, why is the first question not leveled at the genocidal regimes that seek to destroy the Jewish state and Jews worldwide? That baffles me. And as far as a Palestinian state and displacement, you talked about in 48, between 48 and 67, before there was any occupation of any territories, there was no Palestinian state or effort to create one. It was only when Israel had acquired territory in defensive wars that somehow we're talking about a Palestinian state that Israel is only accountable for. I don't understand why the immediate impulse is to turn towards Israel to have full accountability when it's the one defending itself against hostility and continued aggression time and time again.
So I agree with the goal of eliminating Hamas. Hamas should surrender in an ideal world, absolutely. Is the level of destruction, however, being visited upon Gaza in pursuit of that goal, is that something that's sustainable, that can go on? You know, what if it's another, I mean, how many more tens of thousands of casualties would it take to eliminate Hamas? Is it even possible? I think U.S. intelligence officials, frankly, have some doubts about whether Hamas is, you know, as a embedded terrorist group is not equivalent to a state that can actually be overthrown the way Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany is overthrown, in which case all of the death and destruction ends up being not only not worth it, but counterproductive in terms of fostering more terrorism in the future.
Right. Well, so now we're asking a practical, pragmatic, tactical military question, which, let's be frank, none of us in our armchairs in the West are equipped to do. And we still have to remember that none of this would have occurred. Everyone who has been killed so far in this campaign was alive on October 4th, 5th, and 6th. You have to remember that in war, which is ugly and tragic and nobody wants, who's a good-hearted, peaceful person, doesn't want war, but in a war of defense, pacifism, and doing nothing to bring those to justice and rescue the hostages is completely immoral. And as far as what the military tactics should be and how to go about doing it, that's a separate question that a lot of us here feel so comfortable dictating how they should do it and what they should do. I think when a regime like Hamas, which is genocidal explicitly and hateful and murderous, still has hostages, still has a 1-year-old child in captivity and his family. Kfir Bipas just turned 1 year old, and we're not talking about the pressure to be continued to be put on Hamas to de-escalate this situation and surrender. I would hope that there are people in Gaza that can see that when Hamas provokes Israel and aggresses against Israel, and this brings about this destruction upon their population, they would turn against Hamas, which some people are doing. Unfortunately, in Gaza, you don't have a free press and you don't have an open society in which we can hear those voices. In Israel, we certainly do. Briahna, I've heard you use Haaretz sources many times, which only demonstrates a free, robust press that we have in Israel that is self-critical, that is self-reflecting. You don't have that in Gaza, so we don't elevate those voices to see it. When they speak out against Hamas, they're killed. When people speak out against Israel, you just displayed it at the front of this program.
Israel has killed over 100 journalists since the beginning of this conflict on October 7th, in addition to over 25,000 civilians, and 11,000 of those plus are children. About 70% of all of those killed have been women and children, not to mention the devastation that's come from denial of food, water, gas, electricity, medical supplies, et cetera, that's led to widespread hunger and the spread of disease. So I do wonder if you could weigh in on whether you think that is appropriate, and what, if anything, is the ceiling on how many children, women, and other innocents should have to die in Gaza before there is an end to the disproportionate killing here?
Certainly. I mean, the leadership in Hamas, that's billionaires living in mansions in Qatar, could have used a lot of the humanitarian aid and resources in good faith to help build infrastructure, used all that cement instead of building terrorist tunnels for the purposes of killing and kidnapping Israelis, to build roads, to build infrastructure, to build schools, to provide resources, to provide food. They don't do that. They sit in their mansions in Qatar, are worth billions of dollars while their people suffer. And I think it only demonstrates that the effort here is really not to create a thriving, free Palestinian state. It's to dismantle and destroy the Jewish one. You said it before. You think the problem started in 1948 when the Jewish state was created. So the idea here is not to create a free Palestine. It's to destroy a existing Israel. That's what the goal is. So if we want this killing and this destruction to stop, You need to start investing in re-educating your youth and your children to stop hating Jews, which they do, and to stop aggression and attacks against Israel and stop firing rockets. Start investing in your own communities. Start investing in values that the West shares. Start investing in a free, open society and spreading those values instead of values of hate and anti-Semitism and oppression. And these are the values that are being spread in this society, and these are the things that the Hamas leadership perpetuates proudly.
Speaking of investment, America has invested more in Israel than any other country in the world. It's an affluent country. America gives, in the best of times, $3.8 billion on average a year, and has now obviously initialized billions of dollars or more after October 7th. To what extent do you think America should continue to provide aid to Israel as the international community starts to grow in consensus about the violations of international law that are happening in Gaza?
I mean, to what extent? There's an academic discussion to be had about the ways in which Western countries should support each other, but the relationship between Israel and the United States strategically is a very valid one, given that we are fighting a lot of these same enemies, a lot of these same radical ideologies that seek to destroy not just Israel and not just the Jews, but the West in its entirety. So a lot of these enemies are linked. So support for Israel in any which way it can, I think, is completely justified. And how America does that in the form of military credits, in the form of actual aid packages to help defend Israel's citizens against these terror attacks, to help be a secure strategic ally in the region, in a region where Israel's neighbors certainly wish to destroy it, but also the United States. There's a strategic advantage. So the America first argument against Israel doesn't make that much sense to me, given that America and Israel share the same enemies.
Well, and I'll give you the last word here, so maybe you can just respond to this. I think the America First concern is that the U.S. government should it should not do anything to undermine Israel's security necessarily, but that the American government is responsible for the security of the people of the U.S., and that more meddling and interfering in the Middle East, as happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc., inspires terrorism against Western people, against U.S. people, against some of our troops stationed in these countries. We've seen escalation now in the Red Sea with the Houthis. And, from my standpoint, it's not about Israel, I think, has every right, or the people of Israel have every right to confront a terrorist attack and to respond to Hamas. But is it making the U.S. more safe to be, along for the ride, is the American First concern.
Sure. Well, I think there's a lot of, trauma after foreign wars in which America does meddle and it doesn't have a strategic interest, but not every foreign affair is alike. And this idea that America retreats and pulls back from things when we share common enemies, as I said, the Houthi flag, I believe, says death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews. I don't think this is a dispute over geography that America's meddling in. This is an ideological dispute of a clash of civilizations, a clash of values. And so to the extent that America can aid and assist in fighting Israel's enemies, which are also its own enemies, I think there's a perfectly just case to be made for that. And I also just want to say, it's very important for people to have moral clarity on this issue, because it's not just the monsters that perpetuate these acts against civilians that should be condemned, but when we have apologists in the West that make excuses for them, when we call terrorists resistance movements and apply that term so broadly as an abstract term to make things that are not alike, I think we do a lot of damage, and it's just as dangerous to perpetuate those ideas. So I think having this sort of moral confusion and moral equivalency across the board to every single situation, it's perfectly understandable, back to your question, that certain foreign affairs America should leave to the local countries to deal with. But for countries that do share a strategic alliance with the United States, that's a political and military decision.
Ami, thank you so much for joining us. I think it's really important for our audience to hear from a Zionist perspective as well.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.